The machine had been sitting in the county licensing office for 11 years, scanning thumbprints for nurses who needed their credentials, renewed, teachers, bank tellers. The occasional DUI, that was the usual harvest. Nobody expected what it pulled at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning in April when Yuki Ashford pressed her right thumb onto the glass plate and held it there while the device hummed. The clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set woman named Phyllis with reading glasses perpetually perched at the end of her nose, watched the progress bar fill and then freeze. The software had never frozen. She tapped the keyboard. The screen blinked once, and then a box appeared that Phyllis had never seen before, a red bordered flag with a 3-letter agency code she didn't recognize, and a single sentence below it, refer to federal contact. Do not detain, do not alert subject. Phyllis looked up at the nurse standing on the other side of the counter, Yuki Ashford, 34 years old, according to her renewal paperwork. 5'5", slight build, dark hair, pulled into a low practical knot at the base of her neck. She was wearing second-hand jeans and a fleece jacket, the color of dried pine needles, and she was looking at the framed county map on the wall behind Phyllis, with the vague patience of someone waiting for a prescription to be filled. She looked about as threatening as a librarian. She looked like she belonged in a place like Briarvale, Montana, a town of 4,000 people where the main industries were cattle, timber, and minding your own business. Phyllis cleared her throat. System's running slow today. Might take a few extra minutes. Yuki turned and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a suspicious smile. Just the mild, undemanding smile of a woman who had nowhere more important to be. No rush, she said. Phyllis reached under the desk, found the laminated emergency contact card that had come with the new federal integration software years ago, and dialed the number with shaking fingers. Briarvale Rural Health Clinic sat at the end of a 2-lane county road, flanked by elk pasture and lodgepole pines that turned gold every September with a punctuality the Postal Service could learn from. No trauma bay, no surgical suite, no attending physicians on overnight rotation. What it had was a waiting room with plastic chairs and a magazine rack, 2 exam rooms, a cramped supply closet that doubled as a staff break room, and one full-time nurse practitioner, Yuki Ashford. She had been there for 3 years, which in Briarvale was long enough to be considered nearly a local. The people who came through her door were ranchers with lacerations from baling wire, kids with ear infections, elderly patients managing diabetes on insulin. They could barely afford to keep refrigerated during the winter. She knew most of them by name. She knew which ones would lie about taking their medications, and which ones genuinely forgot. She knew that Earl Tanner would drive 40 minutes through a blizzard for a checkup he didn't need, because he was lonely, and she gave him 15 minutes every time, and never once made him feel like a burden. The staff, 2 part-time medical assistants, a receptionist named Carla who kept the schedule with iron efficiency, and a locum physician who drove up from Missoula twice a week, thought they knew Yuki. They knew she was quiet and precise and calm under pressure, in the way that experienced nurses get that particular low-frequency competence that doesn't announce itself but fills a room. They knew she lived alone in a rental house at the edge of town, that she ran the fire road into the foothills every morning before her shift, that she had no social media presence and gave vague, comfortable answers. What they did not know was that the scars on her forearms and left shoulder, the ones she explained as a car accident in her 20s, were shrapnel marks and a partial depth burn from an IED on a mountain road in northeast Afghanistan. They did not know that the deliberate way she moved through a room, always facing exits, always knowing where the nearest hard cover was not anxiety. It was training. They did not know that for 5 years before Briarvale, Yuki Ashford had not existed at all. The woman who arrived in Briarvale with a Montana driver's license, a nursing credential, and a rented Toyota pickup had once been someone else entirely, a CIA Special Activities Division operative. She had operated across 7 countries in 8 years. She had kept men alive in places where the nearest hospital was a 3-hour helicopter flight, and the helicopter wasn't coming anyway. She had sutured wounds by headlamp in irrigation ditches and administered blood products by the light of a cell phone screen and calculated medication dosages in her head while someone was shooting at her from 40 meters. And then one day she had died. Officially, cleanly, a cover story the agency had constructed with meticulous care, until Phyllis called the federal contact number. To understand why a fingerprint could trigger a classified flag that hadn't been touched in 5 years, you need to understand what the CIA's Special Activities Center, formerly Special Activities Division Ground Branch, actually is. Most Americans, if they've heard of CIA paramilitary operations at all, picture it through the lens of movies, analysts turned action, heroes, satellites feeding real-time imagery. The reality is less cinematic and considerably more brutal. Ground Branch is the CIA's direct action arm. Its operators don't collect intelligence in the traditional sense. They conduct raids, capture or eliminate high-value targets, provide security for other intelligence officers in denied areas, and carry out sensitive operations that cannot be attributed to the United States military. They work in the same physical spaces as military special operations, often alongside them but under different authorities and with different rules of engagement that allow them to operate where uniformed forces legally cannot. What makes Ground Branch unusual, even within the larger world of special operations, is the depth of the cover infrastructure. Military, special operators, SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets have service records, even if many of the details are classified. Their existence as federal employees is technically a matter of record. Ground Branch officers operate under non-official cover, or deep cover, backstories that are built to survive sustained scrutiny. Their real identities are compartmentalized at a level above standard top secret. When they're flagged in government databases, the flags don't say CIA Ground Branch. They say something bureaucratically bland that routes the query to a specific counterintelligence contact number and logs the inquiry without alerting the subject. The medical component of Ground Branch, the paramilitary medics who serve alongside operations officers, carries its own particular weight. These are not corpsmen or flight medics in the conventional military sense. They are trained first as operations officers, which means tradecraft, counter-surveillance, cover maintenance, language skills, the dense, invisible infrastructure of clandestine work. The medical training comes on top of that foundation and runs deeper than most civilian practitioners would find credible. Ground Branch medics are expected to perform advanced surgical procedures in field settings with no backup, no sterile environment, and no margin for error. Damage control surgery, tension pneumothorax decompression, cricothyrotomy, tourniquet management under fire, tranexamic, acid, and hemostatic agents in amounts that would alarm a hospital pharmacist. They study prolonged field care doctrine, which accounts for the reality that in denied area operations, a casualty might need to be kept stable, not for the 45-minute golden hour of conventional military trauma care. They are expected to make decisions that no civilian provider would ever be asked to make alone, and to make them correctly under conditions of extraordinary stress without consulting anyone. Yuki had entered the pipeline through an unusual path. She had a nursing degree and 2 years of ER experience before she was recruited, which gave her a legitimate clinical foundation that most ground branch medics built from scratch via accelerated programs. The CIA's trainers had recognized her ability to retain procedural knowledge under stress from her first week at the training facility. By the time she deployed for the first time, she had compressed roughly a decade's worth of specialized medical knowledge into 4 years of accelerated training, and had practiced it in simulation environments designed to approximate the worst conditions a field medic. Nothing fully prepared you for the real thing. No simulation did, but the training got you close enough that when the real thing arrived, your hands already knew what to do, even when your mind was struggling to catch up. Yuki had known this when she set up the new identity. She had known that her old biometric data, fingerprints taken when she first joined, voice prints, retinal scans, existed in a federal database she had no power to delete, only to suppress. What she had not known was that the federal contractor who had maintained the suppression protocol had retired 18 months earlier, that the automatic renewal of the suppression flag had failed in a routine software migration, and that the flag had been quietly, invisibly dormant for a year and a half, waiting for her to touch glass. She had renewed her license every 3 years without incident. This was renewal number 2. The first time the suppression was active. This time it wasn't. She was still standing in the county licensing office, looking at the map on the wall, when Phyllis told her the system was running slow. Yuki had stood in enough rooms to know when something was wrong. She didn't run. Running was evidence. She smiled and said no rush, and she spent the next 6 minutes making a set of extremely quiet calculations. She drove back toward Briarvale on the county road, with the windows down despite the April cold, the smell of pine resin and snow melt coming off the mountains. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her heart rate was controlled, not because she was unafraid, but because she had been trained years and years ago to separate the emotional signal from the functional response. Fear was information. It told her the situation had changed. It did not tell her what to do next. That was analysis. She was running. Analysis. Now, options. She could run. She had a go bag in the house. She had always had a go bag in the house, a habit she had never been able to give up with cash, a backup identity she had constructed herself years ago, and a set of documents that would hold up to intermediate scrutiny. She could be at the Canadian border in 4 hours. She could be invisible again within a week. But she thought about Earl Tanner and his unnecessary checkups and the way he always brought her a jar of choke cherry jam in October. She thought about the Vasquez family, whose youngest daughter had been coming in monthly with asthma that was finally, slowly getting under control. She thought about the pregnant teenager she'd been seeing for prenatal care because the nearest OB was 80 miles away and the family didn't have reliable transportation. She thought about the work, the real, tangible, daily work of keeping people alive in a place where the healthcare system had largely abandoned them. She had been running for 5 years. She was tired of running. She drove past the turnoff for her house and went straight to the clinic. She had a full morning scheduled. She was going to see her patients. She was on her second chart when Carla knocked on the exam room door. "There are some people here to see you, patients?" Yuki asked without looking up. A pause. Not exactly. There were 3 of them in the waiting room. They had made an effort to look like ordinary federal employees, and it was almost convincing. Dark coats, lanyards with laminated credentials, that specific flat-shoe bureaucratic energy of people who move through institutional space all day. But Yuki clocked the tells in the first 2 seconds, the way the one nearest the door had positioned himself to see both the entrance and the hallway. The slight bulk under the left arm of the second one, right-hand drawer. The third had stayed by the truck outside, probably watching the back of the building. She had clocked the dark SUV with government plates in the parking lot when she pulled in an hour ago, and had simply waited. She stood in the hallway, entrance to the waiting room. The nearest agent, a woman, mid-40s, short hair going silver. At the temples, the particular controlled expression of someone who had done a lot of uncomfortable interviews, stepped forward. "Mrs. I'm Special Agent Renata Voss, FBI Counterintelligence." She showed credentials, real ones. Yuki had handled enough document packets to know. "This is Agent Morales. We need to speak with you privately." Carla was behind the reception desk, watching all of this with the barely suppressed panic of someone who had worked in a rural clinic for 12 years and had never needed a single one of the emergency protocols she'd been trained on. Yuki turned to her. "Can you let the 10 o'clock know I'm running a few minutes behind?" She kept her voice entirely ordinary, the way she kept it when she was telling someone bad news. Calm, clear, no drama in it. Then she turned back to Voss and said, "Come to the back." She led them down the hall to the second exam room, which was empty, and closed the door. She sat on the vinyl chair by the desk rather than the exam table, which would have put her lower and farther back from the door. Small things. She noticed Morales note it. Voss set a thin folder on the exam table. "We received a counterintelligence notification yesterday afternoon related to your license renewal." Yuki said nothing. "We have reason to believe that you may have previously held a security clearance with a federal agency, possibly under a different name, and that the circumstances under which you transition to your current identity may require review." She said it carefully, all the hedging language of someone who had been briefed that the subject might be a protected intelligence asset and who did not want to step on a tripwire. Yuki looked at her. "What agency?" Voss's expression shifted by about 2 millimeters, a tightening around the eyes. "We're not able to share specifics at this time." "Then we're done," Yuki said. "Not hostile, not theatrical. Just a flat declarative statement, the kind she used when she was telling a patient no more tests were needed." Morales spoke for the first time. He had a young face with the set expression of someone trying to look older. "Ashford, we're going to need you to come with us for—" "No," Yuki said. "You're not detaining me. Your card says counterintelligence inquiry. That means you're here to gather information, not execute an arrest. If you had grounds for detention, you would have come differently." She looked at Morales steadily. "Was there a third agent in the parking lot, or did you leave someone on the road?" A pause. "Parking lot," Voss said after a moment. "Then you're short for a hard extraction, and you're not here for one anyway." Yuki folded her hands in her lap. "What do you actually need from me?" It was not quite a standoff in any cinematic sense. Nobody drew anything. Nobody raised their voice. What it was a very precise and uncomfortable negotiation conducted across a vinyl exam room table in a rural Montana clinic, while the smell of antiseptic cleaner and the distant sound of a child in the waiting room being read to by his mother. Voss, to her credit, was good. She had been doing this a long time. She leaned back slightly, adjusting her posture from authoritative, official to slightly more collegial, a conscious choice that Yuki recognized as a trained de-escalation technique. "You're right that we're not here to arrest anyone," she said, "and you clearly have some familiarity with how these conversations go. So let's try this differently. She opened the folder and laid a single printed sheet on the table. It was a redacted document, heavy black bars over most of the text, but the header, left visible, said Operational Status Review, and below it a reference number that Yuki had last seen 7 years ago. Yuki looked at the document without touching it. That reference number, Voss said quietly, belongs to an operative who was declared dead in a 2019 field operation. The biometric data from that operative's original onboarding record, a record that was supposed to be suppressed, flagged your print yesterday. She paused. I'm not going to tell you what to say. But I think you know what I'm here to confirm. The room was very quiet. Outside, a truck drove past on the county road. The exam table paper crinkled as Morales shifted his weight. She thought about the particular exhaustion of being nobody, of answering to a name that wasn't yours, of explaining your past in a story that was architecturally true but emotionally hollow, of waking up every morning and making the conscious decision to keep being invisible. She thought about the morning 3 months ago when she had hiked the fire road in the dark and the sun had come up over the Mission Range in sheets of orange and gold, and she had sat on a boulder at 6,000 feet and cried for the first time in years. But from the strange accumulated weight of being alive under false pretenses in a beautiful place you weren't allowed to fully claim. She thought about a woman named Yuki Ashford, who had died of cancer in a Tacoma hospice in 2008, and whose niece she was supposed to be according to the backstory the agency had constructed, and how she had never once looked that woman's obituary up, because she had been afraid of what it would feel like to build your existence on top of a real person's. Grief. She picked up the document. She read the reference number again. She set it down. You need a verbal confirmation, she said. It wasn't a question. For the record, Voss said. Yuki looked out the small window at the corner of the exam room, the parking lot, the SUV, the mountains behind the tree line, still holding snow on their north faces in April. She had a patient in 20 minutes, with an infected puncture wound that needed debridement and a course of antibiotics, and a pregnant teenager at 11, who needed reassurance and a referral. She'd been fighting with the state insurance office to get approved for 2 weeks. Make a call first, Yuki said. To whoever gave you that document, tell them I need a case handler, not a counterintelligence debrief. Tell them I'm not burning this clinic. She looked directly at Voss. I don't have a problem confirming identity. I have a problem with what happens after. Voss held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone and stepped into the hallway. The call took 11 minutes. Yuki spent them reviewing the contents of an imaginary chart on the wall with her peripheral vision, while actually watching the hallway through the narrow gap under the door. When Voss came back, her expression had changed in the subtle way that expressions change when someone has received instructions that were different from what they expected. She sat back down. They're sending a case officer. There will be a formal status review. Your current operational posture. She paused at the clinical language. Recalibrated. Your current situation here will be considered as part of that review. No action before it completes. 48 to 72 hours. Yuki nodded once. Then, have patience. She stood up. She opened the exam room door. She walked back down the hall to the waiting room, where Earl Tanner was sitting in one of the plastic chairs with his hat in his hands, wearing his good plaid shirt. Because a hat and good shirt was how Earl signaled that he considered an occasion worth dressing for. He looked up when he saw her. Everything okay, Yuki? All good, Earl, she said. Come on back. The case officer arrived 31 hours later not 72, which Yuki had expected because the gap between promised and actual in intelligence work always closed faster when someone wanted something. He was somewhere in his 50s, grey at the temples, wearing a fleece vest and hiking boots that looked genuinely used rather than bought for the occasion, which she respected. He came alone. He drove a rental pickup that was considerably less conspicuous than the black SUV from 2 days earlier. She met him at the clinic after hours. The parking lot was empty, except for their 2 trucks and the sound of the wind off the mountains. She had made coffee. She poured him a cup in the break room and sat across the folding table from him, and they regarded each other with the particular mutual assessment of 2 people who have both spent significant portions of their lives trying to read rooms accurately. "Ground branch?" he said. "Not a question. Acknowledgement." "Medic?" she said. "Operations officer, secondary, 7 countries." He flipped open a notebook, actual handwritten notes, which she appreciated on some operational level. Handwritten notes were harder to remotely access. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, Colombia, Libya. Exfiltrated March 2019 after... I know what happened. He closed the notebook. "We had a suppression failure. The contractor who maintained your biometric flag. I know why I'm sitting in this room," she said. "What I want to know is what you need from me, and what it costs." Devereaux wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and looked at her with an expression that contained something closer to genuine respect than the institutional courtesy she'd been braced for. "What it costs," he repeated. "That's a pragmatic way to put it. I've been in 3 rooms in the past 48 hours with federal agents who wanted something from me and weren't initially willing to say what," she said. "Pragmatic is what I have left." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. A coyote called somewhere, up the ridge. Rural silence, the kind that city people found oppressive, and that Yuki had come to think of as the closest thing to peace she had ever known. "We don't want you back," Devereaux said. "Not operationally, that's not what this is about." He looked at the coffee. "The suppression failure means there's an open administrative flag on your biometric record. We need to close it formally. That requires a status confirmation from you, acknowledgement of prior service, and then we run a counter-intel debrief to make sure nothing's been compromised in the 5 years since your exfil. After that, we update your classification, reseal the flag with a better technical implementation, and you go back to your clinic." Yuki was silent for a long moment. "Debrief means they'll know this location. A small number of cleared personnel who already had access to your original file. That's not reassuring." "No," he said. "It isn't. I'm not going to tell you there's 0 risk to your current situation. There wasn't 0 risk when you were running around with live weapons in contested territory either. This is a lower order of risk." She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale through her nose, which was as close as she usually got. "What happens if I refuse the status confirmation?" "The flag stays open, which means it can be triggered again, not just by licensing, but by any biometric touchpoint. Airport, background check for anything, healthcare database, integration. It's not flagged in a useful way now. It's flagged in a cluttered way. The next time someone queries it who isn't FBI counterintelligence, you might get a less tidy outcome." She had known this in a general sense since she had been standing in the county licensing office 2 days ago. She had been doing the math on it, quietly, during every patient interaction and every quiet moment since. She had known since the moment the machine froze that the invisible life she had constructed with such careful architecture was not quite as invisible as she had needed it to be. The question was, what engagement cost and who paid it? She picked up her coffee cup. It had gone cold, the way coffee in a rural clinic break room at 8 in the evening always did. Devereaux waited. The debrief happens here, not a facility, not a field office, not a cleared building somewhere. Here, in this room, she looked at him. And you leave Briarvale out of the documentation. Not redacted. Not named and classified. Just absent. It doesn't exist in any file. Devereaux considered this. The second one is going to require authorization. Get it. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll make a call. The debrief took 2 days and happened across the folding table in the break room of Briarvale Rural Health Clinic. Devereaux brought a second officer for the second day, a woman named Choi, who said almost nothing, and took meticulous notes in shorthand that Yuki didn't try to read. They ordered sandwiches from the diner down the road on the first day and ate them without ceremony, which Yuki found oddly humanizing. It was not like the debriefs she remembered from operational life, which had been fast and adversarial, and conducted under the specific ambient pressure of an organization that needed information quickly and wasn't above emotional leverage to get it. This was slower, more careful. Devereaux asked his questions with the patience of someone genuinely trying to understand a sequence of events, rather than extract a confirmation of a predetermined narrative. He asked about the March 2019 operation, the one that had ended with her official death. She told him what she had never told anyone, not in full, not in sequence, the mission to a contested border area in eastern Syria, the informant whose intelligence had been partially fabricated, the ambush that had not been an ambush exactly, but a controlled collapse of a cover story that the asset had been managing for a year. The moment when she had made the decision to sever from the exfil route and go to ground, rather than fight through a position that was already compromised beyond recovery. She had spent 11 days in the field, alone, working her way to a secondary exfil point she wasn't even sure was still active. She had treated her own wounds with materials scavenged from a pharmacy in a village where nobody spoke any language she knew, using hand signals and a photograph of a medication she needed. She had arrived at the secondary point on a Sunday morning and found it staffed by a contractor she had never met who looked at her like she was a ghost and then started making phone calls. She had been in a debriefing facility in Amman within 48 hours, and the people on the other side of the table had told her, with the particular clinical calm of the deeply professional, that her official status was deceased, that her identity had been publicly mourned. She had chosen the constructed identity in the clinic because of a conversation she'd had during her last operational posting with a female medic from a NATO partner service who had said something that had stayed with her like a splinter. The only purpose of all this competence, all this training, all this survival, is to eventually put it somewhere that doesn't require you to hide it, somewhere someone can see what you're doing and be helped by it. Yuki had spent 8 years hiding her competence, first behind her cover, then behind the careful fiction that she was just a thorough nurse, who was maybe a bit too good at emergency procedures. The rural clinic had been a compromise. Nobody to hide from, mostly. People who needed genuine help. A scaled-down version of the work that still felt like the work. She told Devereaux some of this, not all. He didn't push where she stopped. There were things she did not tell him that she had also not told anyone. The specific quality of silence on the mountain road in Afghanistan the moment before the IED detonated, the way the birds had stopped, the way the air had gone, still in a manner that once you had experienced it, you recognized as a living warning sign rather than coincidence. She had registered it and had not had time to act on it, and the gap between recognition and reaction was 3/10 of a second, and 3/10 of a second was the difference between a full team making it to the exfil point. She did not know how to talk about that gap without the conversation becoming something she didn't have the language for yet, something that lived in a register below ordinary professional debrief. She did not tell him about the agricultural worker she had treated in a remote village in Syria, a man who had been injured by indiscriminate shelling, unaffiliated with any faction. In the wrong place at entirely the wrong time. Who had looked at her with the specific terrified disbelief of someone being tended by a person who appeared from nowhere and spoke his language badly and whose presence in that location. She had stopped his bleeding. She had not been able to do anything else for him. She had left him in the care of people who were trying their best with what they had, and she had not been able to come back to find out what happened. That man had been the beginning of the private accumulation that eventually became too heavy to carry, while also carrying everything else the work required. On the second evening after Choi had packed her notes and left, Devereaux sat with the last of the day's coffee and looked at her with an expression that contained, she thought, something approaching, something that was not institutional. "Off record," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Off record, you found a good place. What you're doing here," he gestured vaguely at the clinic, the building. "The idea of it. It counts, for whatever that's worth coming from me." Yuki said nothing. "We're going to reseal the flag," he said, back to official register. "Better technical architecture this time. Multiple redundancies. You should be clean through any biometric system." He paused. "Briarvale isn't in the file." She exhaled slowly. "Good. If it triggers again," he started. "I'll handle it." He nodded. He picked up his coat and notebook. "I had a go bag," she said. "I know." He stood. "There's no go bag in the file either." She watched him leave. The headlights of his rental truck moved across the parking lot and out onto the county road and disappeared in the direction of the highway. 3 days after Phyllis had called the federal contact number, Yuki Ashford parked her truck in the Briarvale Rural Health Clinic parking lot at 6:53 in the morning, 7 minutes before she normally arrived, because she had been awake since 4 and there was no useful reason to wait at home any longer. The mountains were doing what they did in April, cycling through rain and cold sunshine and occasional brief snow in a pattern that felt personal, as though the weather had an opinion about what was happening below it. She unlocked the clinic, made the coffee, checked the supply inventory she'd been meaning to update for 2 days, and sat at the desk in the second exam room with a blank intake form in front of her. She sat there for a few minutes without doing anything. She thought about the go bag in the back of her closet at home, packed with the careful precision of someone who had learned packing under operational conditions, every gram accounted for, every item dual purpose. The documents, she had been carrying it, metaphorically, for 3 years. The physical bag in the closet was just the material expression of the permanent half-departure she had been living. 1 foot in Briarvale, 1 foot on the exfil route, never entirely committed to either. She thought about what Devereaux had said. It counts. She thought about the specific texture of this work, the work of being the only medical provider within 50 miles for 4,000 people who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, by every system designed to serve them. She thought about the satisfaction of a complicated diagnosis made under resource constraints, of a patient who came back 3 months later looking genuinely better, of the pregnant teenager who had sent her a text last week that said just, "Doc appointment went good," 3 exclamation points, no capital letters. The Pacific orthography of genuine, uncomplicated relief. She took the go-bag out of her closet that evening. After her shift, she laid everything out on the kitchen table. The cash, the backup documents, the medications in their labeled Ziplocs, the small folding knife. She looked at it all for a long time. Then she put it back. Not in the closet. In the garage, in a plastic bin on the shelf, above the holiday decorations she had bought 2 winters ago, when she had briefly and self-consciously decided to try celebrating things. Operational security. But you moved it to a less accessible location when the threat level dropped because proximity to your exit affected your commitment to where you actually were. She went back inside. She ate it at the kitchen table, which she had never used to eat dinner at before, always eating standing up at the counter the way she'd eaten in field positions for years. She ate sitting down. It was a small thing. It felt unreasonably significant. The license renewal was processed the following week. No flag. The system hummed through in the usual 12 seconds. Green bar, no boxes, no red borders. Phyllis didn't know what had happened between her phone call and this moment, and she would never know. She handed Yuki her renewed credential with the mild bureaucratic warmth that Phyllis deployed for everyone. Impartially and without inflection. "All set?" Phyllis said. "Thanks," Yuki said. She drove back to Briarvale on the county road, with the windows down, despite the April cold. The smell of pine resin and snow melt. The mountains doing their thing with the light, catching the afternoon sun on the high snow and throwing it back in that specific quality of high-altitude reflection that you couldn't find anywhere else, that she had come to think of as one of the reliable anchors of this particular life. She thought about what it meant to have a past that was classified and a present that was ordinary, and whether those 2 things could coexist in the same body without one of them eventually annihilating the other. She thought about the women she had known in operational work who had not found exits, who had stayed in the operational posture until the operational posture became the only thing they knew how to be, until the work and the person had fused so completely that they could no longer separate them and didn't try. She had been going in that direction once. She could feel the shape of where that road led. She had turned off it. Not elegantly. Not with a plan, with a small explosion, and 11 days alone in the Syrian backcountry, and a decision made in a secondary exfil point that she had not fully understood at the time. You wouldn't last a day out there, one of the male operators on her first operational team had said to her 9 years ago during a pre-deployment briefing in a facility she still couldn't name. He had meant it as the specific kind of institutional hazing that gets applied to female officers in predominantly male units. Part doubt, part dare, part testing to see if she'd push back or shrink. She had run with a ground branch team through conditions that would have broken most people in the first week. She had kept people alive who had no business being alive, given the state they were in. She had done all of it, and come out the other end, and found to her own mild surprise that what she wanted to do with the specific competence she'd built over 8 years of surviving things she was never supposed to survive was exactly this. There was, as there always is in small towns that do not have a lot of other things to talk about, some talk. The federal vehicles in the clinic parking lot had not gone entirely unnoticed. Carla had texted the other medical assistant, who had mentioned it to her husband, who had said something to someone at the hardware store. By the time Yuki heard the talk third hand, the story had transmuted through the telephone of rural speculation into something involving a federal investigation into medical billing, which was boring enough that most people lost interest quickly. She did not correct the record. What she did do, about 2 weeks after Devereaux's truck disappeared down the county road, was call Earl Tanner. Not because he needed a medical checkup, he didn't, but because she had been thinking about how he always drove 40 minutes through a blizzard, and how she had been, for 3 years, accepting his unnecessary appointments while holding herself at an emotional distance that she was only now beginning to recognize as deliberate and costly. She called him and asked if he wanted to have coffee, not at the clinic, at the diner in town. There was a pause on the line that she thought might be Earl Tanner recalibrating the universe to account for something unexpected. And then, he said with the unvarnished plainness of a man who grew up when plainness was the only available emotional register. They had coffee. They talked for an hour and a half about cattle and the snowpack, and his hip, which was getting worse, and his late wife, about whom he had never spoken to her before despite years of clinic visits, and she listened with the specific full attention that had been, for most of her life, a tactical skill, read the room, read the person, extract the relevant information, and was now just something else. Something without a tactical application, just the simple act of paying attention to another person because they were worth paying attention to. She did not tell him about her past. She did not tell anyone about her past, and she would not. But she had gone, in those 2 weeks, from sitting with the go-bag in the closet to sitting with Earl Tanner at the diner. And the distance between those two things was the distance between running. 3 months after Phyllis's phone call, the clinic had expanded its hours on Fridays. This was Yuki's initiative. She had written a proposal, gotten it approved by the county health board, and coordinated a volunteer locum to cover the extra afternoon. It added 12 appointment slots a week, which was not a large number in any absolute sense, and was an enormous number in the specific context of a county where the unmet need for primary care was not an abstraction, but a face. Told her she could do it by telemedicine, the face of the rancher who had been managing a painful shoulder with ibuprofen for 2 years because he didn't think it was worth making an appointment over. She had also started running a monthly wound care clinic for the agricultural workers who came through during the season, a population that had particular vulnerabilities and particular reluctance to engage with formal health care. She had learned enough Spanish over the years to be functional in a clinical context, which she deployed without ceremony, the way she deployed everything. Carla, who had worked in the clinic for 12 years, and thought she had seen every configuration of nurse and practitioner that existed, had said to her after the wound care clinic's 2nd session, "You're kind of remarkable, you know that?" in a tone that was not flattery, but genuine puzzlement, the puzzlement of someone who could not quite figure out where all this capability had come from and had given up trying. Yuki had said, "I've had good training," which was true, and which was everything and nothing, and which was. She had come to understand enough. The mountains outside the clinic window were green now, the last of the snow gone from everything but the highest north-facing ridges. The fire road was dry. She ran it every morning, the same road she had been running for 3 years, but she ran it differently. Now not as preparation for something, not as maintenance of a capability she might need in a crisis, but just as the specific pleasure of a body that was healthy enough to do it. The light on the lodgepole, pines in the early morning, the way the air tasted at altitude, the sound of her own breathing, steady and clean. She was not invisible anymore. She was not trying to be. She was a nurse in a rural clinic in Montana, and she was also everything else she had ever been, and those things had stopped fighting each other. They were just all her now, at the same time coexisting with the particular grace of things that have stopped pretending the other one doesn't exist. It was not perfect. There were mornings when she woke from operational dreams that were not quite nightmares, but left a specific residue. The smell of dust and aviation fuel, the weight of tactical gear, the clarity of a threat environment that had been despite everything. She had found a therapist in Missoula who had a military background and a no-nonsense approach to complex trauma. She drove down once a month. It helped more than she had expected. The go-bag was still in the garage. She might always need it. She had stopped resenting it. It was not evidence of failure or incompleteness or an inability to commit to the life she had chosen. It was just a contingency, the way a fire extinguisher is a contingency. You kept it, you maintained it, you hoped never to use it, and you did not let its presence mean that you expected the house to burn. She was living in it, in the county licensing office. The software that had triggered the flag was updated 3 weeks after the incident. The federal contractor who handled the maintenance, a young woman who would come on to replace the retiree, ran a full audit of the suppression protocols on record. She found 6 others with similar maintenance gaps. She fixed them, logged the work, filed the report. She did not know what any of the flagged cases represented. She was not cleared to know. She did the job she had been given, thoroughly and without curiosity, because that was what the job required. On the wall above the scanner, there was still a framed county map. It showed the roads and the county lines and the towns and the rivers and the elevation contours of a piece of land where ordinary life was the main industry, and most days nothing happened that required a classified response. Most days people pressed their thumbs to the glass, and the system hummed and the green bar filled, and nothing happened at all. Yuki Ashford pressed her thumb to the glass on her next renewal 3 years later, and the system hummed and the green bar filled, and Phyllis handed her the credential, and they talked for a moment about the weather. Nothing happened. Everything was exactly as it appeared to be. Here is what Yuki Ashford knows that most people will never have cause to learn. Survival is not the hard part. The hard part is what you do with the life that survival leaves you holding. The hard part is figuring out where to put the competence that was built in extremity when the extremity is over, whether to spend the rest of your life maintaining the readiness for a war that may not come, or whether to redirect it toward something quieter and harder to measure. She had been very good at operational medicine. She had been excellent, in a technical sense, at the specific skills that ground branch required: tactical trauma, prolonged field care, austere environment medicine, keeping bodies functional in conditions that were designed to make them stop functioning. She had been good enough to be called the best by people who were themselves exceptional. She was learning to be good at something else, the unhurried, unglamorous, daily work of primary care in a resource-constrained environment. The work of building trust with patients who had learned not to trust systems. The work of showing up consistently in the same place, for the same people, year after year, which was its own kind of service and its own kind of courage, different from the courage required to take fire. You wouldn't last a day out there, someone had told her. 9 years ago, she had lasted a great deal longer than a day. And now she was here, in the place that she had chosen with both eyes open, and the fingerprint machine had done its worst, and she was still here, still pressing her thumb to the glass without flinching, still driving the county road with the windows down in the cold, still running the fire road in the morning light, still gonna work. If this story hit different, if something about Yuki's choice to stay, when every instinct she had was built to run, moved something in you, tell us in the comments. We read every one. Hit that like button if you think this kind of story deserves to be told. Share it with someone who'd understand it, and subscribe for more stories about the people who serve in silence and choose, when they finally get the chance, to serve differently. We'll see you in the next one.